Today, we're talking about a truth that offers comfort and hope in life's most difficult moments. God's compassion in our suffering. Suffering is something we all experience at some point. It may come through loss, pain, uncertainty, or brokenness. But no matter what form it takes, one thing remains certain: God is with us, and His compassion is endless. Psalm 34:18 gives us this assurance: "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." This verse reminds us that God doesn't turn away from our pain. Instead, He draws near, offering His presence and His love when we feel most alone. His compassion is not distant or abstract. It is deeply personal and full of care. God's compassion begins with His understanding. He knows every detail of your struggle, every tear you've cried, and every fear you carry. He understands not just the circumstances, but the emotions you feel, the weight of the burden, and the depth of the pain. In Psalm 56:8, David beautifully captures this truth. "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." God's compassion is also evident in the way He comforts us. He doesn't promise a life free from suffering, but He does promise to walk with us through it, providing the strength, peace, and hope we need to endure. His comfort is unlike anything the world can offer. It is a peace that transcends understanding. In Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and 3, verses 4, Paul reminds us of this comforting truth. "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God." God's comfort is a source of strength for us, but it also equips us to extend that same compassion to others. When we experience His love in our suffering, we are empowered to share that love with those who are hurting, becoming vessels of His grace. Another way God shows His compassion is through His promises. His word is filled with assurances of His faithfulness, His provision, and His presence in the midst of pain. When we feel overwhelmed, His promises anchor us, reminding us that suffering is not the end of the story. In Isaiah 41:10, God speaks this encouragement: "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." God's promises remind us that we are not alone. He is our strength when we are weak, our guide when we are lost, and our refuge when we feel overwhelmed. Trusting His promises gives us the courage to keep going, even when the path is difficult. God's compassion also invites us to bring our pain to Him. Sometimes, in our suffering, we feel the urge to hide or to bear the burden alone. But God calls us to come to Him with everything we're carrying: our fears, our doubts, our anger, and our sorrow. He welcomes us with open arms, ready to provide rest for our weary souls. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus offers this tender invitation: "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." When you bring your suffering to God, you are met with His love, His understanding, and His peace. He doesn't minimize your pain or rush you through it. He sits with you in the hurt, offering His presence as the balm your heart needs. God's compassion is most clearly seen in the person of Jesus. Jesus experienced the depths of human suffering, from physical pain to emotional betrayal, and even the weight of our sin on the cross. He knows what it feels like to suffer, and because of that, He is able to meet us in our pain with empathy and understanding. In Hebrews 4:15 through 16, we find this comforting truth. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Jesus' compassion is not theoretical. It is rooted in His own experience of suffering. He walks with you through your pain, offering mercy, grace, and the assurance that you are never alone. Finally, God's compassion assures us that suffering is never wasted. He uses even the hardest moments to shape us, to grow our faith, and to bring about His purposes. While we may not always understand why we suffer, we can trust that God is working for our good, even in the pain. Romans 8:28 reminds us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." God's compassion doesn't mean He removes all suffering. It means He redeems it. He takes what was meant for harm and transforms it into something beautiful, something that draws us closer to Him and deepens our faith. So, my friend, as you walk through seasons of suffering, rest in the truth of God's compassion. He sees you, He hears you, and He is with you. His love is unchanging, His comfort is endless, and His promises are sure. Trust in His presence, lean into His grace, and know that even in your pain, you are deeply loved by the One who holds you in His hands. As you continue to reflect on God's compassion in your suffering, remember that His heart aches with yours. God is not indifferent to your pain. He is deeply moved by it. His compassion is not passive. It is active, always reaching out to hold you, comfort you, and lead you toward healing. In Lamentations 3:22 through 23, we are reminded of the steadfast nature of His love. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Every day, God's compassion is renewed for you. He offers fresh strength for the journey, fresh hope for the future, and fresh assurance that you are not alone. His faithfulness sustains you, even in the moments when you feel like giving up. One of the ways God's compassion is revealed is through the way He gives us strength in our weakness. Often suffering leaves us feeling powerless, but it is in these moments that God's power shines most brightly. His compassion reminds us that we don't have to rely on our own strength. He is our source of endurance and resilience. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, Paul shares God's promise, "But He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me.'" God's grace is sufficient for every trial you face. When you feel weak, He is strong. When you feel like you can't take another step, He carries you. Trust in His compassion to provide all that you need, moment by moment. God's compassion also invites us to find community in our suffering. Sometimes pain can isolate us, making us feel alone in our struggles. But God often uses others to be vessels of His love and comfort. Through the support and prayers of others, we experience His compassion in tangible ways. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 2, we are called to carry one another's burdens. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. When you open your heart to others, You allow God's love to flow through them into your life, whether it's through a friend's encouragement, a kind word, or a prayer offered on your behalf. God's compassion is often revealed through the community He places around you. Don't be afraid to lean on others. They are part of His plan to support you in your suffering. Another aspect of God's compassion is the way He uses suffering to draw us closer to Him. Pain often strips away the distractions of life, reminding us of our need for God and deepening our dependence on Him. In these moments, His compassion becomes even more real as we experience His presence in a profound and personal way. In Psalm 73:26, we see this truth. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. When everything else feels uncertain, God remains constant. His compassion invites you to draw near to Him, to find refuge in His presence, and to rest in His unchanging love. In your suffering, He becomes your strength, your portion, and your peace. God's compassion also reminds us that suffering is not the end of the story. While it may feel overwhelming in the moment, His promises assure us that there is hope and joy beyond the pain. He is a God of restoration, and He is faithful to bring beauty out of even the hardest circumstances. In Peter 5:10, we are given this assurance. And the God of all grace, who called you to His eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. Restoration is part of God's compassionate plan. He sees your pain, and He is already at work bringing healing, strength, and renewal. Trust that He is leading you to a place of restoration, where your suffering will be transformed into something beautiful. One of the greatest expressions of God's compassion is the hope of eternity. In Christ, we have the promise that all suffering will one day come to an end. There will be no more pain, no more tears, and no more sorrow, only the joy of being in His presence forever. Revelation 21:04 paints this beautiful picture. It will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. This promise gives us hope in the midst of suffering. It reminds us that God's compassion is eternal, and that one day all things will be made new. Hold on to this hope, knowing that your current pain is temporary, but His love and peace are everlasting. So, my friend, as you walk through seasons of suffering, let God's compassion be your comfort and your guide. Rest in the knowledge that He is near, that He understands your pain, and that He is working to bring healing and restoration. Trust in His promises, lean into His presence, and let His compassion fill your heart with peace and hope. You are never alone, and in His unfailing love, you will find the strength to endure and the assurance of brighter days ahead. As you continue to rest in God's compassion during your suffering, let His presence remind you that He is not just aware of your pain. He is actively at work in your life, even when it feels like nothing is changing. God's compassion moves Him to act, to comfort, and to bring hope into the darkest moments. He is a God who sees, who hears, and who responds with love. In Exodus 3:7-8, we see God's heart for His people. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them. Just as He heard the cries of the Israelites, God hears you. He is not distant from your suffering. He is present in it. His compassion moves him to intervene, to guide you, and to rescue you in ways that only He can. Even when you don't see it, He is working behind the scenes, preparing a path of deliverance. God's compassion also invites us to find purpose in our pain. While suffering is never easy, God can use it to shape us, to deepen our faith, and to equip us to serve others. When we lean into His compassion, we begin to see how He can bring beauty from ashes, turning our struggles into testimonies of His grace. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 5 through 6, Paul speaks to this purpose, "For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. If we are distressed, it is for your comfort and salvation. If we are comforted, it is for your comfort, which produces in you patient endurance of the same sufferings we suffer." Your suffering is not meaningless. God's compassion transforms it into an opportunity for growth, for healing, and for extending His love to others. As you experience His comfort, you are empowered to be a source of comfort for those who are walking a similar path. Another powerful aspect of God's compassion is His invitation to trust Him with the unknown. Suffering often brings questions. Why is this happening? How will this end? But God gently reminds us that we don't need to have all the answers. His compassion assures us that we can trust Him even when the path ahead is unclear. In Proverbs 3 verses 5 through 6, we're given this wisdom: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Trusting God in suffering doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending it doesn't exist. It means placing it in His hands, knowing that He is faithful to guide you through it. His compassion gives you the courage to release your fears and to rest in His perfect plan. In your suffering, God's compassion also reminds you of your value. Pain can sometimes make us feel unworthy or forgotten, but God's love speaks a different truth. You are deeply cherished by Him, and nothing you experience can diminish your worth in His eyes. In Matthew 10:29 through 31, Jesus speaks of God's care for each of us. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows." God's compassion assures you that you are seen, known, and loved. No matter how heavy your burden feels, His love for you remains constant and unwavering. Let this truth anchor your heart, reminding you that you are never forgotten. As you continue to walk through suffering, remember that God's compassion provides a path to healing. Healing may not always look the way we expect. It might be emotional, spiritual, or relational. But God's compassion meets you where you are, bringing restoration in the areas of your life that need it most. In Psalm 147:3, we see this promise: He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. God's healing doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it. He binds up your wounds, making you whole again. His compassion works gently, restoring your heart piece by piece, and leading you toward a future filled with hope. Finally, God's compassion reminds us to keep our eyes on eternity. While suffering is painful, it is not permanent. Through Christ, we have the assurance that one day all pain and sorrow will be replaced with eternal joy and peace. This hope gives us the strength to endure, knowing that our present struggles are temporary in light of eternity. In Corinthians 4:17 through 18, Paul offers this perspective: For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. God's compassion points us toward this eternal hope. It reminds us that no matter how heavy our suffering feels, it will one day give way to the glory and joy of His presence. Hold on to this promise and let it strengthen you as you continue to trust in His love. So, my friend, as you journey through your pain, let God's compassion surround you. Lean into His presence, trust in His promises, and know that He is walking with you every step of the way. His love is unfailing, His comfort is endless, and His plan is perfect. In His compassion, you will find the strength to endure, the hope to press on, and the assurance that you are never alone. As you continue to reflect on God's compassion in your suffering, remember that His compassion is not limited by time or circumstance. It is constant, unwavering, and deeply personal. God's compassion isn't just a feeling, it is an active force that meets you in your pain and brings about real transformation and hope. One of the most beautiful aspects of God's compassion is that it provides rest for your soul. Suffering often leaves us feeling weary, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. But in God's compassion, we find a place to rest, to be renewed, and to regain the strength we need to keep moving forward. In Psalm 62, 1-2, we are reminded of this rest. Truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him. Truly, He is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. God is your rock and your refuge. When the weight of suffering feels too heavy to bear, He invites you to lay it down at His feet and rest in His presence. In His compassion, He strengthens you for the journey ahead. God's compassion also gives you permission to grieve. Sometimes we feel pressure to get over our pain quickly or to mask our struggles. But God's compassion allows you to feel the depth of your emotions, to grieve what has been lost, and to process your pain honestly. He meets you in your tears and assures you that it's okay to mourn. In Ecclesiastes 3:04, we're reminded that there is a time for everything, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. God's compassion doesn't rush you through the process of healing. He sits with you in your grief, offering comfort and understanding. Take the time you need to feel, to process, and to let His love gently restore you. As you lean into God's compassion, you'll also discover His ability to carry what you cannot. Suffering often brings burdens that feel overwhelming, but God's compassion invites you to release those burdens to Him. He is strong enough to carry them and faithful enough to work through them for your good. In Peter 5:7, we're given this encouragement: cast all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you. When the weight of suffering feels unbearable, remember that God is willing and able to carry it for you. Casting your burdens on Him is not a sign of weakness, it's an act of faith. Trust that His compassion will sustain you and provide the peace you need. God's compassion also inspires hope. Even in the darkest moments, His compassion assures us that suffering is not the end of the story. He is a God of redemption, and He is always working to bring good out of pain. His compassion shines light into the darkness, reminding us that hope is never out of reach. In Lamentations 3:21, verses 23-23, we see this hope beautifully expressed. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God's faithfulness is the foundation of your hope. Each morning, his compassion is renewed, offering you fresh strength and assurance. Even when the path feels uncertain, his faithfulness reminds you that brighter days are ahead. Another way God's compassion manifests is through his ability to turn suffering into purpose. While we may not always understand why we experience pain, God promises that he can use it to bring about growth, healing, and even blessings. In his compassion, he transforms what was meant to harm into something that can bring glory to him and good to you. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph reflects on this truth. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Your suffering is not wasted. God's compassion works to redeem it, turning it into something that can bless others and deepen your faith. Trust that he is using even the hardest moments to shape you and to fulfill his purpose in your life. Finally, God's compassion invites you to fix your eyes on him. When we focus on our pain, it can feel overwhelming. But when we focus on God, we are reminded of his greatness, his love, and his ability to carry us through. His compassion shifts our perspective, allowing us to see our struggles through the lens of his grace and power. In Hebrews chapters 12:2, we're encouraged to keep our eyes on Jesus, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. When you look to Jesus, you see the ultimate expression of God's compassion. He endured suffering on your behalf, and through his victory, you are promised the strength and hope to endure your own struggles. Keep your eyes on him, and let his compassion guide you every step of the way. So, my friend, rest in the knowledge of God's deep compassion for you. In your suffering, he is your refuge, your healer, and your hope. Trust him with your pain. Allow him to carry your burdens, and let his love renew your spirit. With his compassion as your foundation, you can face each day with courage, knowing that his faithfulness will never fail. You are not alone. He is with you, always. And so, my friend, as you walk through seasons of suffering, let God's compassion be your anchor. His love surrounds you, his strength sustains you, and his promises remind you that brighter days are ahead. Rest in the truth that he sees your pain, he hears your cries, and he is working even now to bring healing and restoration. No matter how heavy the burden or how long the journey, you are not alone. God's compassion is unending, his faithfulness is unshakable, and his presence is constant. Trust in him, lean into his love, and know that in his arms you will find peace, hope, and the strength to carry on. You are deeply loved, and in his compassion, you will always find everything you need.